Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's LinkedIn Live. I'm Alex, and I'm excited to discuss a critical topic for procurement and supply chain leaders, the impact of tariffs on indirect procurement. Tariffs are driving up costs and creating new challenges across multiple categories, from office supplies to logistics. Today, we'll cover how tariff changes are affecting indirect spend, strategies to manage cost increases and supplier risks, and real-world examples from industry leaders. Whether you're leading global procurement or managing indirect sourcing, this session will provide practical insights to help you stay agile. Drop your questions in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Today, we're joined by 4 GEP consulting professionals, each one an expert in a specific category. Ryan Shadle, Senior Director, will provide tariff-related insights for IT and telecom. Daryl Watkins, Senior Director, will offer valuable tariff-focused perspectives for real estate and facilities management. Vipin Gupta, Director, will share key takeaways regarding tariffs for capex and construction. And Abhinav Gupta, Senior Director, will deliver in-depth analysis of the impact of tariffs on MRO products and services. Let's get into this interesting and extremely relevant conversation. Ryan, I've heard you talk about the 4 R's of tariff mitigation. First of all, can you define what those are for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 4 R's are redistribute, replenish, renegotiate, and re-engineer. And this kind of came together as our category leaders, obviously a few weeks ago, aligned around tariff mitigation. We see lots of nuances across direct and indirect categories, but as we kind of roll that all up, there really are these 4 R's that emerged as kind of a simple framework that we can use to think strategically about, category by category, and also to help our clients to mitigate risks. So when we talk about redistribute, we're talking about diversifying your supply base and reducing that reliance on some of those high tariff regions. This is kind of evolving across categories, sourcing equipment or components from countries that have free trade agreements, and also less exposure to some of the trade tensions. On the replenish side, we're talking about forward buying, a lot of stockpiling of critical equipment parts, especially when tariff hikes are anticipated. Leveraging free trade zones and smarter inventory consolidation is helping our clients to avoid costs in these areas. The third R is renegotiate. Tariffs have changed the economics of just about everything, but especially long-term procurement contracts. We're seeing our leaders revisiting pricing models, cost-sharing clauses, and when the opportunity arises, restructuring service agreements to really manage these potential shifts in the future. And our last R is re-engineer. And this is where our clients are stepping back and sort of rethinking about how work gets done, redesigning supply networks, shifting from models that involve less products or hardware in IT and telecom side, and also sort of driving demand management in other areas to mitigate where we see that tariffs are in some cases unavoidable. So all of these are not one size fits all, but essentially they give us a playbook and help us to respond quickly, and proactively to help our clients with tariff mitigation.
Okay, thank you so much for that definition. Let's take this down to the next level. So what do each of these R's mean for each category? Let's start with redistribute. Daryl, let's start with you. Will you take us through real estate and facilities management and how they're redistributing?
Yeah, so from a standpoint of redistributions, we have opportunities to look at this in various states. I really enjoy the concept that we have put together for around these 3 R's. So the 4 R's, so counted into redistribute as well. So when we look at it from that lens and what we're talking about from a redistribution standpoint, we're looking at moving things away from the traditional norms. So looking at it maybe from shifting maintenance and materials into low tariff regions, right? Areas that we are going to have opportunities there. You have to consider, though, with real estate and facilities management, specifically FM, I know is there's a big reliance on service. So when we talk about services, you're not going to have the traditional levers that may come into play that are in some of the other areas of opportunity. So when we're talking about that, we have to keep some of that into consideration. But when we look at some of the excuse me, the material impacts, those will definitely have a play there. And we look at that, how that impacts the supply chain. I know Abhinav may be able to dive a little bit deeper, but you have a parallel path with MRO and facilities management. So when we have those parts that come into play, some of those cross a fine line, whether it's facilities related maintenance or MRO type parts. But on the service side of things, that's where we focus a lot from the facility standpoint. So, but that's, where we want to look at and make sure we have an opportunity to move the materials away from some of those high tariff areas and look at secondary regions for sourcing those particular parts.
I can share some of my insights around how we are diversifying and redistributing in the capex space. What we are essentially advising our clients are to diversify their supply base from some of the high tariff regions into some of the tariff advantaged regions, as we would call it, the lower tariff regions, or the ones with some free trade agreements. And many of the companies, they are being advised to follow a dual or multi-sourcing strategy, leveraging suppliers. For example, outside China, which is one of the regions with very high tariffs. And what this does is this helps build resilience against supply chain shocks, not just the tariffs, which obviously is top of everybody's list now, but what we've been seeing over the last few years, be it pandemic, be it supply disruptions, be it wars. So that's a natural strategy to diversify your supply chain and help build more resilience. Another thing which is very important, at least in the field of capex, is we are also advising clients to strengthen and reevaluate their domestic supply relationships. In many cases, it's important to rerun that evaluation of what the cost looks like with the tariffs versus when you use local suppliers. And there are a few advantages to using local suppliers, not to mention at the very least the reassurance of a stable supply and locked in prices, and the exposure to volatility and the international markets goes away. So those advantages are there while moving to local suppliers. As examples, we are seeing some companies pivot back to local US-based suppliers for things like steel and aluminum. Companies are looking near shore to places like Mexico for other USMCA compliant goods, be it automotive tools, be it solar panel mounts, for example. Maybe I'd like to hand it over to Abhinav to reflect on how we are using this lever for MRO.
Yeah, thanks, Vipin. Very good points on the capex front. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks, Alex, for the introductions earlier. I do a lot of MRO procurement at GP, and I wanted to share some thoughts on MRO from a tariff perspective. So let me start by giving some context on the MRO side. What we are observing is that a large percentage of the engineered parts coming into US traditionally have been from China. As much as 80% of the parts have been coming from China, which is a very large percentage. And then there is more from Vietnam. But Vietnam is a normal tariffed country currently, at least from an MRO parts perspective. China is highly tariffed, as we all know. So therefore, the MRO impact is significant. And also, it is worth mentioning that the overall situation is unpredictable given the upcoming US-China negotiations, which will be happening over the next few months. So it's uncertain what will be the outcome of those negotiations and what will be the tariffs after that. So one, currently high tariffs, and two, uncertain in the near to mid future, right? So in terms of strategies for handling this situation, our suggestion is that manufacturing organizations work closely with their MRO distributors to, one, understand what is the nature of the tariff impact, right? Because it's a complex upstream supply chain wherein distributors are sourcing a variety of MRO from many different manufacturers who then have their varied country footprint in terms of where they are manufacturing. So fairly complex, and distributors will be best placed to give an understanding of what is the nature of that tariff impact. So that's one. And two, it also makes sense to then work with those distributors to define the right mitigation strategies. These distributors are already working with their manufacturer partners and changing the mix of manufacturers that they are purchasing from, etc., to minimize or counter the impact of these tariffs. And it would make sense to just work with these distributors to minimize the impact on the customer. Right, on their end, manufacturers are also looking at changing the mix of their own manufacturing footprint in terms of moving more manufacturing to those countries which have a relatively lower tariff regime. So the distributors and manufacturers together are working on this, and we can just work with them to mitigate the impact. For the simpler items, as compared to the engineered parts, if I talk about simpler items like steel pipes, wires and cables, simple fittings, that's where it is relatively easier to find alternative supply chains that are not heavily dependent on China. But certainly for engineered parts, there is a stronger dependency on China. In terms of working with the distributors, let me also say that these distributors will prioritize their key strategic customers, right, in terms of price mitigation, supply resilience. So, more than normal circumstances, it is important to strengthen the strategic partnerships with these distributors, to get their help in risk mitigation. So let me pause here and hand it over to Ryan for his commentary on IT.
Thank you, Abhinav. I think there's a lot of recurring patterns that we see here across areas, and I think within the IT telecom space, primarily, the categories that are heavy on the product side, hardware, infrastructure, et cetera, are really where we're seeing direct impacts. But because software and services run on infrastructure as well, there's definitely indirect impacts across all four of our major category areas. We are seeing similar moves, shifts towards hardware sourcing, outside of China. Also kind of, in our area, we have the ability to leverage white box solutions. So there's a lot of countries like Mexico, Vietnam, and areas in Eastern Europe where we can buy white label equipment. And we're seeing some clients, even look at this as a temporary strategy while things maybe sort themselves out. Also seeing, a lot more dual sourcing. It's a viable strategy anyway, but in this case, bringing in, competitors and challengers in less challenged areas. And we're also seeing a good bit of, companies that have regional assembly capabilities, that can help to shorten lead times. We're seeing equipment shifted, all over the planet over the past month to accommodate some of this, and to sort of sidestep some of those hotspots. Overall, I think for IT procurement, it's an area where, telling our clients what kind of equipment to use or where to get it from can be a little challenging and tricky. I think what we would sort of, stress is you can be a part of the conversation, and there's real value here to be had in bringing up some of these suggestions. So, have the conversations with your stakeholders. So that's it for this one for me, Alex.
Thank you all for those insights. Let's get into replenish. Ryan, will you start us off with how IT and telecom leaders are using this lever to mitigate costs?
Sure, happy to. I think similarly here, we do have the ability to impact when we buy equipment, how we buy it, how we refresh it, et cetera. So I think, typically, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of stalling of refreshes and buying hardware. I think that is absolutely, part of the equation here, but we're also seeing a lot of forward buying, right? So, companies who know they have major upgrades or transformations coming up, getting ahead of that equipment, locking in pricing, or actually buying, routers, switches, servers, et cetera, to get them ahead of any changes. In addition to that, I think increase in our clients centralizing their hardware inventories. A lot of times for end user computing, et cetera, there's stockpiles. And so shifting those around, increasing the quantity, et cetera, is something that definitely has a lot of positive impact. And then another thing, again, as I said, services can be very infrastructure or hardware heavy. So in areas like that, infrastructure as a service probably being the most prime example. We're also seeing some clients reaching out to providers to sort of lock in fixed reserve instance or just kind of pay as you go pricing again ahead of some anticipated hikes that we might see out there. So I think that's kind of how it plays out in my space. When I think replenish, I definitely think of facilities. So Daryl, do you want to maybe give us a little overview of what you're seeing there?
Daryl, you're on mute.
Yep, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, you called out some similar points as I referenced also, though, in redistribute when we were talking about a little bit of that aspect of it. We are heavily based service when it comes to FM, but in the same construct as you mentioned, Ryan, buying ahead still is giving us that flexibility and opportunity to impact some of the inventory and the various parts that we will be receiving when it comes to things like HVAC filters or motors. Lighting may even be one that has a heavy impact there, but that's something that's really going to be, the catalyst to help us avoid some of those hikes and driving price up during the positioning of the tariffs and such. The other aspect of that, though, that we may not be considering too much or may not have thought through is having flexible warehousing, leveraging some of the 3PLs and areas to be able to bring about shoring that's going to help us bypass some of the tariff delays, when it comes to that. So that's an impact as well, because some of the timing of that, facilities, when you have a part down, it really impacts a lot of the operational aspects of a building. So you definitely don't want to have those things lingering. And so when you have the ability to stockpile and bring that to bear, it comes into a matter of that. But what we won't want to do is overbuy as well, because we don't know how long the tariffs are going to be in place. And so therefore you have that inventory cost associated with some of that also. So it's a fine balance that you have to strike when it comes to that. But having some of the warehousing examples and leveraging that in a strategic way, the FM teams can then respond faster to some of those maintenance needs and avoid excessive stockpiling. So that may be one way to offset it as well with the flexible warehousing. But, as we talk about that a little bit later, more, I know Abhinav has, again, these parallel kind of interactions with MRO and with FM. So I'm sure he has some ability to elaborate a little bit more on the part side of it as it pertains to MRO, since there is a close tie. So what are your thoughts there, Abhinav?
Yes, Darren. On the MRO front, some of the suggestions I would make is one, bulk buy inventory in advance while the tariffs are still to be applied, right? So that would make sense as long as there is ability to store extra inventory. Because what we are seeing is that suppliers are not willing to give future fixed pricing is what we are seeing in the market, because of this unpredictability or uncertainty which is there as to what will happen with the tariffs. But what they are willing to do is to sell current inventory which they've already purchased, which is already available with them at agreed prices. So again, if there is ability to store extra inventory, it would make sense to pre-buy that inventory for the next number of months and preempt those price increases. Customers can also get into arrangements like consignment inventory. That would be a good arrangement if the suppliers are open to that. Another suggestion I would make is to also revisit safety stock levels, right? Because it's a very volatile situation and there might be lead time challenges and even supply disruptions. So to manage that, it may be useful to adjust some of the safety stock levels as well. So yeah, those are some of the suggestions on the inventory and replenishment front. With that, let me hand it over to Vipin to cover some points on capex.
Thanks, Abhinav. And I think most of the important highlights have been covered. But specific to capex, what we are seeing is that companies are utilizing advanced purchase, especially for commodities such as steel, concrete, lumber, all of which go in the construction industry. On the equipment side, the utility is a little bit more limited, only applicable to short lead time equipment, which would be able to hit the shores before the tariffs kick in. But in spite of all this, especially on the construction side, advanced purchases has still been able to keep the costs and the schedules in check and mitigate against price rise. But by the nature of capex itself, we do not have a lot of repeat purchase, so the utility of this lever is a bit limited. With this, I'll hand it back to you, Alex.
All right. On to renegotiate. Abhinav, how is this playing out for MRO products and services?
Yes, Alex. So on the renegotiate, right, which is a very important lever for all the categories we are talking about here. On the MRO front, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to partner with the MRO distributors to get their help in eliminating or minimizing the price increases because they are managing the upstream, like manufacturer mix and so on, as I mentioned earlier. Now, any price negotiations that we are doing moving forward, it is important to ensure that we are incorporating clear price revision mechanism in those negotiations and the upcoming agreements, so that there is a transparent way of changing the pricing and we can accordingly manage any further changes in the tariff regime. One small but important point I would like to mention, because we have seen it with some of our customers, is that we need to ensure that the distributors are not marking up the tariff itself. Their markup should be on the rest of their cost structure, but the tariff itself should be either passed through or even lower than the tariff if the supplier is willing to take some of that tariff increase on their side, but certainly they should not be marking it up. So very important point to keep in mind. Another different point I also wanted to mention was that given this situation, it may also be a good idea to at least explore associating with one of the GPOs or group purchasing organizations, because they would also be carrying out their negotiations with the distributors which are in their partnership mix. So it's something to consider if it works out in terms of better pricing, particularly for those MRO buying organizations whose MRO spend is not extraordinarily high, right? If the total spend is, say, less than about $100 million, this might be a good option to consider and evaluate. So these are some of the things I wanted to mention on the renegotiate front. Let me, with that, hand it over to Ryan for covering some of the IT points.
Thank you, Abhinav. And I think what we're seeing, at least early stages here, is something very reminiscent to what we saw a few years ago with COVID, as it related to sort of supply chain availability provisions in technology agreements. Here we're definitely seeing a push to revisit and sort of incorporate as a best practice covering all of the price caps, escalation clauses. And I think in a lot of ways, price caps and escalation clauses are very much part of our everyday life in technology, but sort of specific to some of the shifts that we've seen recently here, to shore up some gaps there. Both OEMs and resellers on the equipment side are impacted here. We're also seeing a look at kind of bundling everything together has been the predominant trend across all of technology space and as a service kind of shift over the past 10-15 years. Because of this, we're seeing clients take a look at some of those agreements that have let's say infrastructure bundled inside with a managed service agreement, and determining whether it makes sense to keep those coupled, to allow those suppliers to kind of manage the equipment purchase and tariff mitigation, or whether that's something that would be better brought in-house. Definitely a case-by-case kind of answer to what is the right answer there, but a lot of interest there. And then I think the other thing, and we've heard it a couple times, is what we're seeing is kind of software and services predominantly. A lot of vendors are they would be coming to you in a standard ask for a price increase. This really helps them to add some inertia to that, and really kind of make it more pronounced. I think what we're saying here is we all know that tariff impacts are real, but we should be able to identify and point exactly to where they're affecting or impacting any of our suppliers, and push back at the mere mention of we need 5% more because I don't know tariff, right? So I think just be fact-based, in your approach, and hopefully that will provide better results and stamp down some of those requests for increases. So with that, Vipin, do you want to walk us through a little bit of perspective on capex and construction here in this R?
Sure, Ryan, and interesting to see the kind of success that different categories are having negotiating on tariffs with their suppliers. Specific to capex, we are seeing the most amount of success, especially across either high margin equipment categories such as production equipment or packaging equipment, where the suppliers have a lot of room and they are willing to share some of those costs. So our recommendation there is for our clients to definitely go ahead and negotiate some cost sharing mechanisms with their suppliers for such equipment. Or on the other hand, some of those more competitive equipment like the HVAC equipment, where there are a number of options and the suppliers have no option but to share a portion of the tariff if they want to stay competitive. Some of the negotiation levers that our clients have had success using, things like contract extensions, service agreements, preferred supplier agreements, some of our usual negotiation levers that we see. Another important area of negotiation with the clients that we see is price adjustment mechanism, something that Abhinav also alluded to earlier. And this obviously helps provide some amount of control over the price increase and cushion against the volatility driven by unpredictable nature of tariffs. Specifically in the case of capex, organizations are having success either on the commodities which are highly index driven, or again on those high value or long lead time equipment and projects. And the reason there is that these provide a long lead time from the time the contract is signed to the delivery, and leaves a lot of room for the tariffs to introduce volatility. So it's very important in such cases to have an adjustment mechanism as to how, in case the market changes, the tariff rate changes, how the rates will be passed on, or what percentage would be passed on to the client. Similarly, for repeat purchases or where we see staggered deliveries, that is another area where we see a lot of clients willing to negotiate adjustment mechanisms. Another area is milestone-based payment terms, which I would say, especially in case of capex, is rather standard, but clients should definitely not forget this very important lever when negotiating on tariffs, and this does provide risk mitigation both for the client and for the suppliers, and uh, provides a steady cash flow, at least an assurance of a steady cash flow, and uh, some mitigation of risk for the different parties. With this, let me look into how facilities and real estate is negotiating with their suppliers. And let me hand it over to you, Daryl.
Yeah, thanks, Vipin. This is probably one of the areas that we finally get a chance to be creative here. When it comes to FM reengineering, renegotiating, this is where we really can dive in and be creative and help our clients with, some transformative thought processes in this space. Tariffs by design are altering the cost structure, right? And so when you look at it from a bit of the indirect categories that support facilities management, and paralleled and on the peripheral of facilities management, we have operational expenses that come about, and those benchmarks are no longer going to be relevant, right? So now is the time to reset and manage expectations, not only with the supply base, but with internal stakeholders as well. We have an opportunity now with that being the case to look at how can we take those service contracts and revisit the scope for those. There's now rationale for it. We also can make sure that we don't have overruns by managing that internally as well, and then having just the level of visibility and understanding of what we're working through, and looking at the transparency. There's a lot of opportunities that we can do to just build overall stronger supplier relationships. So looking at the SRM process here as well is an opportunity for us now to gravitate and become stronger with our providers. I mean, the service providers that are existing in this space now have an opportunity to really change the narrative, how they see their customers and how their customers see them. So from that standpoint, doubling down on the SRM process of that really, I think, is a key component of this as well. So when you look at from that, between renegotiating and reengineering, there's a lot of creativity that can come on about that part. So I know we're diving into that. So last but not least, I'll pass it back to you, Alex, to kick off the reengineering side.
Absolutely great points. Thank you all. So let's get into reengineering. Vipin, we'll start with you. How are you helping CapEx construction clients optimize and automate their processes?
Alex, reengineering is a very important lever, especially in the capex, and the reason is that capex by nature is highly discretionary. A number of our clients, they are taking the liberty to delay or downsize their non-essential capex spend, especially firms that are highly import dependent, or where they're seeing uncertain customer demand. These are areas such as retail, electronics, automotive, where we see the news of investments which have been paused in response to the tariffs. However, the question you might ask is, if an organization still needs to ramp up production or just realign their production to the domestic market again in response to the tariff, how can they do that while not investing any money in capex? And the answer to that, that we've been telling our clients, is to leverage the other tools of investment. Some of that, could be uh, explore leasing, explore renting, explore things like equipment as a service. And what that does is that helps us not just avoid tariff, but also preserve your capital for possible investment in future case scenarios which are more favorable. And in that case, you may even have access to, for example, more upgraded technologies. Now, the question is, if a company still needs to invest capital, and their capital investment would be subject to tariffs in some way, we still do have ways to mitigate that. And I broadly put those levers in two buckets. One is re-engineering of the product itself by changing either the materials or the methods. by which the product is manufactured. And the second, the sort of levers that we broadly classify as tariff engineering. So when we talk about product re-engineering, either some of the examples I can share is, for example, many of the companies are using cross-laminate timber as an alternative to steel, and that helps them reduce tariff. Similarly, fiberglass as an alternative to aluminum. When it comes to methods, the new technologies that we see, especially in construction and engineering, things like prefabrication, modular construction, building information management, automation, and value engineering, all of these are great levers to bring about efficiency and reduce costs. And then the second set of levers I was alluding to, the tariff engineering. There are broadly two ways to do that. One is lowering the impact, lowering the import valuation of goods using one of the mechanisms. Could be transfer pricing, could be using first sale for export instead of the final pricing, or by unbundling your cost and taking out the one time or the unnecessary costs from the price that you paid tariffs on. Another lever here is redesigning your products itself to lower the tariff classification. An interesting example I have is in case of industrial machinery, if you import the whole machinery as one, it's a completely different and higher tariff classification versus if you import the machinery in different components. Similarly, electrical generators, inverters, uh, many companies, if there are thresholds which uh, above a particular threshold, the rate of tariff is much higher. So companies are able to reduce their tariff rate drastically just by reducing the voltage or power rating of their equipment by a couple of volts, for example. So yeah, some really interesting things going on in this area in capex. But let me maybe hand it over to you, Ryan, and uh, see what's going on in the IT space.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vipin. And I really like the sort of two-sided structure that you draw out there. I think it definitely applies to our space as well. Within technology, I think we're seeing, mentioned a lot of these things in other kind of areas already, but we are seeing model shifts. So, if we've got models that we can move to more OPEX, less CAPEX, less equipment, et cetera. I mean, this has been desirable, to technology organizations for a long time, but taking another look at that now in light of the new, kind of circumstances we're looking at has definitely provided some value. Another thing we're seeing, which kind of, shifts things backwards a little bit, but it certainly makes sense, is seeing, customers looking at, whether they should hang on to on-premise, in-house infrastructure assets. A lot of them are struggling, have been struggling for a long time to shift them out to hyperscalers, infrastructure as a service providers, et cetera. In a lot of cases, having your own equipment that is, depreciated, you own it, it can't be impacted by tariffs, leaves you a lot less exposed than, in the hands of a managed service provider who's handling infrastructure behind the scenes. So definitely, a little bit of a kind of regression in some ways, looking at, should we be pushing everything out to third parties when some of it we can control a little better when it's in-house. Re-engineering, refresh cycles, and rollout plans is a tactical thing that is relatively easy for some of our clients to do when they see sort of trouble ahead. But it's definitely something that we've also picked up across various client environments. And then I think, the most creative or the most necessary one, probably in our space is, sort of shifting your focus away from tariff impact areas and looking at the rest of your, landscape. Organizations, some, have more focus than less on demand management, utilization control, right sizing, et cetera. What we're seeing here is if we know tariffs are coming in areas A, B, and C, then, number one, let's make sure that we have our demand and utilization correct in those areas. But let's also look at the other side of the house and, bring down costs wherever we can so that if it becomes a little bit of a give and take, we will see increases in some areas, but really pushing that down, by taking sort of alternative tactics, in say software and services where they're not as heavily impacted. Definitely something that we would recommend, and we're seeing an increase of across our client base. So how about an MRO, Abhinav? How's this sitting with you there?
Yes, Ryan, very good points on the IT front. On the MRO, as far as re-engineering is concerned, the typical value engineering levers that are routinely applicable in MRO, they become even more useful when the component costs are going up like this, right? So, for example, spec rationalization or substitution with higher energy efficiency components. Those can be very useful levers, when your current component costs are going up. When I talk about use of higher energy efficiency components, some of the very good categories or product types to consider that for our motors and compressors, for example, which have a very high percentage of energy consumption cost as part of their total life cycle cost. So worthwhile to consider. Manufacturing organizations can also consider use of refurbished or reconditioned parts, right? We in normal course also we suggest that as a important lever because there is a significant cost difference between a new part and a refurbished part. But in this case, the delta could be even higher, right? So consider refurbishment, repair, and reuse of parts. Another suggestion, which again it applies in day-to-day, MRO, even if the tariffs were not there, is to consider replacing OEM bought-out parts to aftermarket suppliers to generic parts basically, because many of the parts which we buy from the OEMs are not actually manufactured by those OEMs necessarily. All are not proprietary parts, and the OEMs are buying from elsewhere, and then we purchase from them. So to identify those parts and buying from their actual manufacturers or the distributors of those manufacturers is a good strategy. One more thing I wanted to mention, which I sort of missed out on saying when we were talking about redistribute, but I can say here is to consider use of 3D printing providers who are near shore or who are near to your manufacturing location in the US, for example, instead of using the OEM for that, particularly for the non-critical OEM parts, right? That could be a good idea to evaluate, because if there are 3D printing vendors which are located near to your manufacturing location, one, it could lead to a lower cost, but two, it can also help in lead times and ensuring that you have supply assurance, if this evolves to a scenario where there are supply chain disruptions. So yeah, those were some of the aspects I wanted to bring out on the MRO front. Daryl has been rightly mentioning that the MRO and FM are quite interlinked in many ways. So what are the thoughts, Daryl, on the real estate and FM front?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Abhinav. And as mentioned, this is where we can be creative. Between renegotiations and re-engineering, you have the opportunity just to kind of open up the art of possible. And some of those things may not be as favorable as you may think or want them to be, such as deferring maintenance in favor of reactive maintenance. This is an idea that we're kind of flipping on its head a bit, because we are typically steering our clients more towards preventive maintenance. But in times of critical business impact, sometimes you have to look at the offsets. As Ryan mentioned, some areas of the business are going to take on costs while we make and reduce costs in others, and this is one of those areas. I mean, we definitely, that recommendation comes with a lot of caveats, right? First and foremost, and a lot of people may be cringing and getting a little bit of a hives just at the thought of thinking of that side of it. But I would definitely recommend that only for non-critical assets. And when you're talking about doing it, it's still only temporary. I mean, this gives us some breathing room, but it's when it's going to be something that's stretched out for a longer period of time. If we have an immediate need, definitely would look more towards a renegotiation route versus trying to just switch your overall aspects of preventative versus reactive maintenance. Those are things that a lot of organizations have worked years to get on a consistent cycle, and we don't want to disrupt that too much. But when you're talking about cosmetic repairs or some other things that, system tune-ups and things like that, that may be where you can actually bring in those reactive manners and not do it on a consistent basis. If something just needed a refresh, a touch up, those can be pushed out for a little bit. But we definitely won't want to do anything that is going to lead to a long-term degradation. That's just something that's counterproductive for the business and will cost you more money in the long run. But Vipin mentioned a few things around capital that if we kind of tie all this together between the four of us, looking at it from an alternatives perspective, like Abhinav mentioned as well, what are our lease versus buy scenarios when we're looking at equipment that we're utilizing? Are there opportunities for used equipment? In some instances, there may be things along the line of cleaning or fleet type of equipment that we're utilizing that may be able to go into that used category that still can be acquired from a tariff-free aspect, but still meet the needs of the business and the operational requirements that are still going to help us maintain the facilities in the way that we do. But when you think about it from that standpoint, also looking into leasing flexibility and how can you just overall keep expenditures low while trying to navigate this uncertain economy. So those are some things that I would just bring to bear as it rounds out the conversation from the REFM standpoint as it pertains to the 4Rs. So really enjoyed the conversation, and I'll pass it back to Alex just to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all so much. This has been such an enlightening conversation, and we have been getting questions in from the audience. Reminder to everyone who joined, if you do have questions, go ahead and add them to the chat. And let's get started with the first question, which I'll direct towards you, Daryl. Which of the 4Rs do you see companies leveraging most effectively?
Well, going back to my two favorites, right? Renegotiate and re-engineering, I would say still, especially in the short term, as we were talking about when addressing that, renegotiations are something that can be utilized because of the creativity around it. It doesn't have to be price yesterday versus price tomorrow, right? We talked about some scope changes, opportunities to just revisit how we do things today in a way that can impact our ability to deliver that particular service. So that's something that we can adjust, especially in the short term, to be a little bit creative and bring about some thoughts there. Any other thoughts from the team?
As you rightly mentioned, Daryl, of course, in the shorter term, it will have to be replenished and renegotiate. Re-engineering, or even to some extent redistribution, is a slightly higher lead time activity, would take more time to do, but those can also be quite effective, especially in my area, such as capex.
Fair point, Vipin. Fair point.
All right. Thank you, guys. Next question, which I'll direct at you, Ryan. What are some of the biggest challenges associated with effectively utilizing these levers in this environment, and how can procurement overcome them?
Sure. I mean, I think there's an element of easier said than done to a lot of what we're saying today when you kind of, bounce it up against reality.
Yeah.
Limited supplier options is a big one in, I'm sure, every area, but certainly in mine. Never mind tariffs. Like, you don't have options of who you can, buy certain things from in the technology space, regardless. And so I think ultimately here, there may be options where we're not seeing them. I'm not saying it's that bleak, right? So procurement needs to really double down, research those alternatives, and figure out kind of where there are opportunities and bring those to the business. Replenishment is tricky because we're, forward buying sounds great until all your money is gone, right? So, definitely goes against a lot of our, clients' kind of overall principles of how to save cash. Renegotiation is great unless you can't do it because you're locked in a contract, right? So it does take the opportunity, to be there to be able to get into that. And then I think the biggest one that's challenging is that, re-engineering and a lot of the creative things that, Daryl's referencing, we're all referencing, it requires alignment. We can't decide as procurement professionals, this is how things are going to be. But we are in a great position, to be able to kind of be in between all of those constituencies and help to kind of lead that charge, bring thought leadership and proactivity to the situation. But in some cases, these are big mountains to move. And so depending on the client environment, gaining alignment around making a big change can be hard enough, let alone sort of making it. So, levers are effective, but procurement has to be proactive, well aligned internally, et cetera, to make them work. I'd say those are the main things, Alex.
All right. And last question that we have time for today. Vipin, this will be directed at you. How can procurement leaders better plan and budget to minimize the financial hit when tariffs change unexpectedly?
Thanks for the question, Alex. And the way I see it really is a three-step approach. Step one, assess the impact of tariffs, possibly even forecast. Step two, monitor. And step three, mitigate. Just coming back to step one, because I see that as the most important one. How do we assess and forecast the impact of tariffs? So usually what we do is we run a scenario analysis. What's the impact on the landed cost of your overall COGS based on different levels of tariffs? And at GP, we help many of our clients, for example, build AI-driven cost models and dashboards to do this. What we see come out of it usually is a sensitivity analysis by supplier, category, geography that helps us uncover what are those high-risk zones. In the monitor phase of it, we essentially need to make sure we have our ear to the market. We see where the market is going and what the impact on our high-risk areas are. But in parallel to that, we also need to start taking those mitigation steps. And I don't need to dive into that. That's what the 4 Rs have been alluding to over the last 1 hour or so. But it's very important to know what are the areas to mitigate, what you are trying to mitigate. Sorry, Alex, back to you.
Oh, no problem. All right. Thank you guys all so much for this awesome presentation. And thank you everyone who joined to listen. If you asked a question that we didn't get to, we will be following up with you with that answer. We will also be sending out the recording of this session. So once again, thank you all for your time today, and everybody have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.